Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Education Elevated, a podcast from Avenues The World School in New York City. I'm your host, I'm Todd Shy, and I'm the head of school at Avenues. Several years ago, the E.E. Ford Foundation organized a small group of school leaders to study and reflect on one of the most pressing, complex issues facing schools everywhere, which I'll describe as the pressures of polarization, pluralism, of shifting norms around speech, and the overall purpose of school. That working group produced a document that was shared with independent schools last spring. It's called Thriving in a World of Pluralistic Contention, a framework for schools. My colleagues and I were eager early readers. I'm joined by one of those colleagues, Ted Ogden, the Director of Teaching and Learning Avenues, who I think may have read this framework more times than any person not associated with the composition of it.
It might be up there. Thanks, Todd. Glad to be here. Glad to be here, John.
And we're especially pleased to welcome John Gulla, the Executive Director of the E.E. Ford Foundation, who helped make this framework happen. John's career in independent schools is long and storied. He served in leadership roles at St. Anne's in Brooklyn, at the Isidore Newman School in New Orleans, at the Riverdale School in New York, at the Blake School in Minneapolis. For the past 11 years, John has been with the E.E. Ford Foundation. John, we're thrilled to have you join us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And John, let's talk about the framework first, just in terms of the context of what led to the production of this framework.
Sure. The questions at the heart of the framework have been of interest to me personally for a long, long time. I think as long as I have been a professional, some of the questions about expressive freedom or intellectual diversity, a little less the discipline non-partisanship. But it was after the summer of 2020 when many schools were struggling, and we all were wrestling with the results of the pandemic, that some of the focal areas began to crystallize for me. I'd begun conversations with a number of school heads because in my work for the foundation, I spend a considerable amount of my time in conversation with those who are leading schools about issues for me that centered around student self-censorship, about polarization, about the difficulty in this highly contentious, divided society that was having adverse effects on the culture of schools. I had some conversations with Lee Levison, former head of Lee School here in New York and a longtime friend of mine. I also was put on to John Austin, head of Deerfield, who I'd understood was interested in some of the same thoughts. But the launch of the framework really began when I was sent a video of John Austin's address to the Deerfield community at Parents' Weekend in the fall of 2021. John had things to say to the parents who would come back to Deerfield, a boarding school in Western Massachusetts, for the first time since the pandemic, and began to express some of his hopes of what they collectively at Deerfield would undertake there at the academy in the goals, the purpose, the overarching drive for the school. I began a conversation with John. I was impressed. I wanted his permission to send around that video, which I did to many, many people who were involved in the conversation that I'd been in. And John and I began to talk. He was interested in pursuing this or with assistance from me and potentially the foundation, seeing if there's some way that this could become a broader conversation in the world of schools. I said, if you're going to do this, you could come to the foundation with a proposal, but you'll need to have a project manager for that. You're going to be too busy, and that's not what I do. And that's how Lee Levison came to be involved. Lee was interested, having been retired, to be the project manager. So it began as a John Austin, Lee Levison endeavor, John Gulla coaching from the side.
You talked about student self-censorship, But I remember 2021, I think school leaders were checking themselves too. These were hard conversations to have that John engaged with in 2021. It seems to me the framework is trying to redirect us a little bit, or pushing back on some trends. What do you think those are that the framework is nudging against or redirecting?
I'll talk about the trends. Let me, in some ways, just add to that story a little bit, because I think it's part of the rollout of the framework and why it has been successful. When John and Lee brought an initial proposal to the Every Ford Foundation, I had done the work I need to do with my board. The decisions for funding from the foundation are made by a board of 12 people. I make recommendations, but I have power of persuasion. I do by myself, but thinking that, but I don't make the decisions, the board does. Their first proposal to us, the board said no. And I was disappointed and a little bit surprised. But the board had a rationale, and they thought that this was potentially contentious and that it would benefit from having more than John Austin, Lee Levison, John Gulla associated with it. The second submission of a proposal was one informed by 8 school leaders from schools, well-known schools, and influential, thoughtful leaders who didn't all bring the same perspective and who helped work with John. It's still John's documented in his voice, but it evolved as a result of the 8 people who were part of the task force to become a stronger and, I think, broader and more grounded document. To the trends, I think that the goal was to assist schools in having conversations about difficult topics that were sensitive enough that many people were simply avoiding them. And the idea was not to be prescriptive, but instead to develop a broad and widely, we hoped, applicable tool that would allow schools to engage in these conversations with the faculty, potentially with the board, with parents, maybe in some ways with students, but there would not that we had a particular end in mind. There were concerns that we had, given the heightened tensions and volatility, that it would be seen as being prescriptive or a reaction to some progress and advancements and changes that had happened in the world of independent schools, at least. But that wasn't the heart of what we wanted to bring to it. We wanted a historical grounding, to have a thoughtful approach, and to give a meaty document to the world that they could sink their teeth into and pursue their own understanding of how they may wrestle with these questions.
I just remember the pressure. Ted, you sat in my office with me. Things would happen out in the world, and a bunch of us would gather in the morning and say, do we need to frame some sort of work with students around this? Do we need to communicate anything? Like we were feeling that pressure pretty regularly.
Yeah, I mean, it was coming from ourselves, I think, but also from our families in a way that felt, in some cases, beyond intellectual and just deeply raw. I think the conflict in Israel and Gaza last year is an example of one of these really contentious issues in the world right now. And if it's so complex, its history stretches back so far, it felt like there were this just impassable gulf between perspectives on either side. And there was, I believe, a really strong request from many in our community. What does the school think about this? Challenging us, saying, are you values free? We need to hear, and there's a tradition around the Holocaust of institutions being silent in the face of just enormous inhumanity and cruelty. So those are some of the things I think we heard and felt. You cannot be still, you cannot be neutral in this moment, in this time. We need to hear support. And so it puts incredible pressure on an institution and a school. And I think this is a way of saying one of the main things I appreciated here is to be nonpartisan is not to be inactive, to be neutral, to be value-free. It is actually an active way of coming back to what is the purpose of schools, and paints a picture of what it looks like, how schools can be in the world, still be a place of building community, and what their role is with children and learners, that is separate from making grand pronouncements about everything in the world. Can I actually, on that principle of disciplined nonpartisanship, if I have it right, I think at a conference you and I were both at recently, John Austin might have mentioned that the task force had originally centered around the word neutral. If I have it right, I think it comes from the Calvin Reporter, may have been influenced by it in the 60s from the University of Chicago. And John said there was a purposeful choice to shift to disciplined nonpartisanship. I wondered if you could speak to the reason for that shift, why that seemed like a stronger choice, disciplined nonpartisanship rather than neutrality.
Sure. I have to state at the beginning that as the executive director of Foundation, I was not sitting in on all of the discussions that took place with John, Lee, and the 8 task force members. I had regular communication with John, Lee, and less regular but sporadic conversation with the task force members. So participated in the evolution of our thinking in that way. But you have it right that initially that first proposal that the EE4 board rejected, wasn't rejected because it had the language of neutrality, but one of those areas of evolution as a result of the input from the members of the task force was to move to the term disciplined nonpartisanship. I want to add several things to what you just said. First, just to give some response to the very good points and insights that we had. In the 1960s, there's a whole movement of what is called value-free education, which I've always held to be oxymoronic. I don't believe such a thing really makes sense to me. I think there are explicit or sometimes implicit values that underlie so much of any intentional educational community. There are values that don't have to be partisan. And to the example that you cite, which has affected all, particularly in higher education, but in secondary education as well, there are horrors and difficulties and historical challenges of what's happening in the Mideast. One of the regrets that I had, and that I hope perhaps the framework contribute to, was refocusing on the purpose of what a school does at that moment on October 8th and beyond. And one of the things that happened in some schools that turned out, from my exposure to it, to have been beneficial was what used to be called the sort of learn-ins. So the regular business of school was halted, and intense study of how this situation came about. How many high school students knew about the British Mandate or the Balfour Committee, or some of how we'd come to this? They could have strong, passionate, idealistic adolescent reactions to horrors on both sides as this unfolded, but they needed a context, a short context, why this has been as sustained a global political challenge as it's been. That's what schools can do. Even at higher end, the schools that I think managed it did that. Dartmouth did a wonderful job. They had the head of the Islamic Studies and the Jewish Studies department offering joint seminars to the entire Dartmouth community so that at least people could have some accurate historical understanding of how this had become about. Of the 3 pillars, I think it's fair to say that a significant majority of the conversation that I've had since May 1, when the framework was made public, has been about the disciplined non-partisanship pillar, more so than the expressive freedom or intellectual diversity.
Where's the pushback been, or what's the conversation been?
One is that, and this is why I think the task force was as valuable. John Austin has, and then you will know if you read the transcript of that speech, he was making a parallel argument to the journalists, and particularly to not editorial page journalists, but to that kind of neutrality. One of the pushbacks has been this understanding that that's not wrong, that readers of this, faculty members reading this, have resisted this idea that their own political opinions or philosophical stance may not be may not be wise to share that. And that's not even my interpretation of the framework. My interpretation of the framework is that make that a thoughtful choice if you as a teacher are going to do that. Understand the imbalance of the power dynamic. Understand how that may be misinterpreted by some of your students. But if you are going to reveal your own personal political positions, do that with a recognition of what the risks of that are. But where there's been pushback has been for some who said, I could not fail to do that. I have conversations, private conversations with students after class, not with the entire class, who push me on that. And for me to put up a wall and say, out of bounds, is potentially jeopardize the nature of the relationship that I am trying to create with them, a relationship which I'm trying to use, not to have them think like me, but to think, right? And I'm not willing to risk that. I've had great conversations with people that I respect. They do that about some aspects of their life. They're not self-revealing of all elements of their life. But if you are a history teacher, a political science teacher, it's a little bit more challenging if a student in good faith comes up to you to ask, what is your take on this? That's right. And this is where it's been so interesting that because you're at the conference. I hadn't anticipated this, but some the question we received in advance of that had to do with faculty members concerned if their schools were using the framework, having these discussions. They said, does this mean I can't make a political contribution to a candidate because beyond a certain dollar level, I have to report where I work? Will that adversely affect me? Yeah. And I don't think there was ever anyone's intention that any of their personal items would be curbed in that way. It could participate in rallies and in marches and be active citizens. It is more the responsibilities they had in the classroom and their engagement with the curriculum and the seats.
It seems to me, one, I was a classroom teacher for 20 years, and I imagine the mistakes I made or the lines I crossed and tried to navigate these things is in the hundreds, not in the dozens. And so teaching's a hard job, and I assume good faith for teachers showing up and trying to do the right thing. I also think there's one of the things we value is authenticity in kids and in adults. Like, you want a feeling in the community that people are being authentic. So I think that's where, my good faith interpretation of where teachers maybe approach that line is they're just trying to be authentic with kids, and that's understandable and to some extent applaudable too, right? Yeah. But that the question that I want teachers to ask and myself to ask is, what do the kids need from me? Not what do I want to share? That's right. And I think if you're asking yourself that question and then you make the choice, that I'm willing to work with you on that and forgive mistakes, and because what you're trying to do is to think about what will help the kids. Right. Sometimes teachers aren't asking that question, and that's where I think I want to push and say it's not your job to get students just to understand you. Right. It's your job to help them understand themselves and the world and
either one of the pillars, right? This is the second of these three pillars in the framework. It's written in bold: discipline, non-partisanship. We do not reveal our civic and political convictions. But there's that incredibly important line in there that says, unless it might actually support student agency. And I think that's a really helpful question. When might sharing something actually that is my own personal political civic commitment, when might it actually support students' agency? So it's not a question of do I share or do I not. I think the authors are urging us to come back to that. What is the choice I'm making? Always in helping students become their own distinct thinking individuals.
I think it's sometimes helpful to draw parallels to other ways of knowing, other areas of exploration that take place in schools. There is less sensitivity and hesitation in aesthetics, where teachers are often quite eager to proclaim the beauty of something, a piece of music or a work of art that moves them, and they would not in any way feel that they were serving their students by expressing their own personal tastes and biases. But and I think this is going back to what you said. It's because of the way that the more polarized larger world has evolved. It's made this high stakes issue in schools where, and we haven't talked about it, but I think it's also true that the extent to which in tuition charging schools, there's this risk of a transactional relationship. And I'm paying the tuition, and I'm demanding some consideration be given to the a point of view that is important to my family, to our family.
Well, what's the difference between me introducing a new novel and saying, "Oh, I love Virginia Woolf. I hope you guys are going to enjoy this book too. She's an incredible writer," and I'm clearly weighing in on what I think about Virginia. What's the difference between that and introducing a historical unit of study and say, fill in the blank president was a transformational figure that made our country great, or is it the contemporary issues that are more fraught?
Well, I do think that those that are temporary are sensitive, more fraught, we should say. But I don't know that there's, epistemologically speaking, what's the difference? I don't know that there's a difference. It is the teachers not, in my opinion, would be less effective. I like what you added to the conversation in that qualifier in the framework. It has to be assessed through the effect of the pedagogy on the students. But there is that parallel, it seems to me, that what literature teachers are going to pretend they're neutral regarding all writers, all equally compelling to that. It's just not accurate. And there are opinions that the teacher will have about civic figures, political leaders, issues of the day.
I had a lunch conversation today with a student so our summer reading assignment involves teachers recommending books and kids picking the book they want to read and then engaging with the teacher. And I'm a thorough reader, so thank you. And a student read Walden and set up time to come talk to me about it. We had this wonderful conversation, but he knew I loved Walden. He asked me questions about it. I told him what I was disappointed in the book, why I thought it was great. He did the same, and we were engaging at that level of responding to the book, and he was interested in my response. But that's a similar category from a student coming in engaging with me about political issues, or right or no? What's the
to offer a different perspective? I think to me the question comes back to what do I feel in this, if I'm in this conversation, is at stake. And if what's at stake is whether Virginia Woolf is a transformational, innovative writer in the 20th century, that might be deeply personal to me, but for most of our students, probably not. But if what feels at stake is my basic rights, policy, where the country is going, I think that is a universal thing. We respond differently when people disagree, when we feel something elemental is at stake connected to my rights? And so to me, that is an important distinction. It might not change the kind of norms we want to establish, but I think we have to acknowledge that. And sometimes one party feels stakes that others may not, or may not even be aware of. So I don't know. I would add that's part of the context.
I agree. It wasn't accidental that further brought up aesthetics, because I do think these different spheres of ways of knowing, talking about these earlier, but the epistemological foundations of different areas of a curriculum. There is greater agreement in the natural sciences and in mathematics.
Yes.
They drive to agreement that yields in the end not a Uruguayan and a Kenyan and a Canadian physics, but a physics that has largely to do with the epistemological framework, the scientific method, the testing, the falsifiability of knowledge in that realm. Same does not hold true. We don't end up driving to a unification in aesthetics, that there is some range. Then I would place certainly that social sciences, somewhere in between, where the implications for life, for our shared communal life, our political life, the rights we enjoy or do not enjoy, the way we are oppressed or exploited or not, all of those, there's a cost in those things that make that higher stakes.
That's right.
But I don't know that there's certainty to that. I am convinced personally that there isn't the certainty in some of those social science realms that natural sciences are not.
That's right. Although there also, you'll help me here, there was a time when the debates around physics were tied to consequences. Was it Newton or Copernicus? Help me here. Oh. But one of them was placed in jail. Galileo.
Point.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. That's the one I was thinking.
Bruno,
right?
Take through the attention. Yes.
Right.
We're talk about a way to get adolescents into
but
march through the street. Yeah.
But there we're back to something beyond, like our modern conception of the scientific method. Here are the agreed upon ways of knowing. That is not what was happening then, right? It was connected to my understanding of God and the world, and what's right and wrong.
It is with that period began to emerge that practice of being able to subject a new paradigm, because that's what it is. If there is, this is part of a reason that we need the openness. And take this really good example. Within the school, there has to be the possibility that card faculty and believes the school aren't the sole possessors of received wisdom that's not going to change. So science itself devolves, and with abundant evidence, there needs to be the courage to alter the way in which you view the world. We were talking about your TC connection. You need and Maxine Green.
Yes.
Maxine's influence on me is profound. One of the things that she said repeatedly is to be well educated is to possess the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. Yeah. And I think that's the heart of part of what we're saying, that you could have passionate commitments, but a good education provides you access to the mindset of someone who's disagreeing with you. Right. And if you possess a burning curiosity, you may also want to know why they think that way. And then you might have a better chance of a conversation with some development of areas of common ground, of agreement, even with differences of opinion.
Yeah. What was the phrase again? The ability
to see things as if they could be otherwise.
So I wonder as well, we had talked a little bit earlier about some of the forces that are named in the framework are the last 10 years or so. But we have been talking about the postmodernist movement, and I wonder if there's a connection there as well, right? Postmodernism, probably reductively, is a movement that says, let me step outside of common sense and look back and understand. It's connected to a fragmentation of truth or a denial of any version of truth. And I wonder if those two are connected. The ability to step outside of and see something new is incredibly powerful, can help us see something we hadn't before, but it can also result in many factions all stepping outside and then struggling to say, what is it that we can agree on? What is it that unites us? It seems like another one of, I don't know, I'll offer that as another tension that's brought some positive change, but also maybe brought us to the current moment.
I think when I get stuck in these really contentious, tense, polarized fragmentation questions, I want to pick up a novel, or I want to have conversation in a different way, because it seems like these things are just continue to be sort of immovable forces. There's a great, I know I've quoted this to Ted before. There's a line from Wittgenstein who says, if the rock you were trying to move won't budge, try moving some of the smaller stones around it instead. And I feel like with these issues, it's like, what are the little small stones? And maybe it's reading Virginia Woolf, or having a conversation about Thoreau is an indirect way of moving a conversation.
Delighted you said that. I'm not least bit surprised. And it's one of the great values of literature curriculum is that it's not a question of what's on the bestseller list, but what questions are wrestled with by the author.
Yeah.
How does a thoughtful reader come to appreciate the world by allowing yourself to be drawn into that world as constructed by a writer?
Yeah. I want to make things hard on all three of us here.
Please.
It's a question for both of you. We've really benefited from this framework, John, so thank you and the team for making it happen. One of the things we did last spring, it came out on May 1st, and I had 2 end-of-year parent reading groups read a couple of things, and we met and discussed them, and this was one of the offerings. So I had 2 reading groups, where groups of parents read this. We had really rich conversations. It was great.
Were you reading Chekhov with the other?
Yeah.
Just to come back to your...
No, it's the novel Orbital, which everybody should read, to Samantha Harvey.
Yeah.
But a parent began, we had this wonderful discussion, and her first comment was, I don't understand how anybody could disagree with anything in here. And it struck me. One, I also think it's a powerful and really thoughtful document. But I thought, well, I'm going to push myself to answer that question. And I want to push the 2 of you to answer that question. How could somebody disagree? What are the areas where somebody could disagree with this?
I will tell you some areas where people are disagreeing with it. Not it's not going to be hypothetical. For me, there is a section where the framework references one of the modern challenges is this creation, and it really is a modern creation, very modern creation of a therapeutic approach to school. And that and this is where it gets close, so there's an alignment with postmodernism, that if I, as a single individual in the school community, possess the subjective power to claim something that makes me feel unsafe, and that is veto power for that idea or conversation. There are people who believe in the framework who think that's risky to do that. There are those, however, who will say, no, that's that right of that individual student to claim that he feels unsafe needs to be on, no matter what the evidence is. And there is great disagreement. There's an energized and passionate disagreement on that point.
I think it would not be contested at all to say that there are people who've come through schools, through independent schools, in prior generations and current ones who have been deeply hurt by the culture, but potentially by structures and systems. And we are, I think, to use a single framework through like neurocognition, we're starting to understand that that my sense of belonging is correlated to my ability to learn. And so I think that, and then we also know there are historical injustices that have played in our schools: segregation, harassment, bigotry. And so to me, that feels like one of the things in tension is that we can look at and probably generally name, although some of these questions are contested, but a perspective says we know that schools have not always been caring places. We know that has effect on students' learning. We know that has effect on our ability to graduate students who can be full and flourish in the world. And so it's a balance, because for anyone to say, this hurts me, I do not feel safe, everything must shut down, there's no way we can support that. That leads to nothing. But we also have to acknowledge the other side, that we do have not lived up to our duty to care for kids and for adults in our schools. And it's where you draw the line is the difficult thing, and where people might disagree.
Highlighting that as an area of some disagreement, don't want to be misunderstood, because I agree with that it is necessary for every student to feel as if the school believes in them, supports them, cares about them, does not permit things to happen that cause them to question their membership, their sense of belonging in that community. It's more the intellectual ideas that may be foreign, right, to someone. So again, referencing some of the chatter we had before we started, but trigger warnings. I think it is entirely reasonable that a sensitive teacher, if she or he happens to know that they may have some students, or may even want to say there are going to be challenging portions of this work of literature. And if, as you read that begins to bump through, by all means, seek me out. But I'm not going to not choose some works because I have to find a middle road that will avoid anyone being confronted with challenging ideas, and even ones that this is an exaggerated example, but I'm wondering if both of you know about high-profile case that happened in Minnesota with image of Muhammad in
Yes,
art history teacher's class.
yes,
Now, I think this is just an example of where there is disagreement.
that's right.
As far as I know, and because I lived in Minnesota for 14 years and know some of the people who were involved, not directly, but somewhat indirectly, I think my facts are reasonably accurate. But I think that adjunct professor did everything that one could reasonably have wanted to have announced that this was a part of the curriculum, that there were some students who might be uncomfortable. There were alternate assignments that were going to be possible. This was a work of art that hangs in a prominent museum in Scotland that has been cited by dozens and dozens of scholars as a work of art. But it violated the principle of some who believe that any visual representation of the Prophet Muhammad is off limits.
Yep.
She nonetheless went ahead to got her department's approval, had the lesson, and ultimately was fired because there was a political blow-up that I think ultimately had much more to do with those forces outside of the academy that were latching on to this, and somebody needed to win, and they wanted to. They needed the power, and I don't think this is good for them cold where they will seek truth and beauty, but where there needs to be a good faith ability to approach things and not shut down by what might be strong political opinions of a segment of the community.
Yeah, we've struggled mightily with this because we love kids and want to take care of them, but we also know that to grow and become strong, you have to encounter things that make you struggle and resist. And I've struggled with that line. The pandemic made it worse. I think we all our compassion and commitment to kids increased even more than it already is as teachers with young people. But I've struggled to figure out, like, what's the criteria in my own head. And there was a recent profile of Judith Butler in the New Yorker. And she had an encounter with somebody, and it was a little bit of an aha moment for me. It's like, this might work. I'm trying this on for myself to see if this criteria works. Because a woman had challenged her and said, you are harming, I can't remember if you're harming me or harming my kid with what you're saying. And Judith Butler got really, it was the description of it was beautiful anyway. She had a conversation with her and said, you and I are trying not to be, we don't want to be afraid. We don't want to fear something. Can we have coffee and talk about this? And that was an aha moment for me, because I thought that language might work. That if I have a kid in a space and they're uncomfortable or even in distress or even offended, that's different from somebody feeling really afraid. And I'm trying that on as a criteria of, will it work for me to say, I don't want anybody to feel afraid in a space. And if you are feeling afraid, I'm going to stop. Like, we're not going to do this thing. But if you're feeling discomfort or you're upset, or those things those can be healthy emotions. I don't want the fear.
If our responsibility is to help young people make their way in the world, better understand the world, but if there are some sensitive topics that are off limits, hide their own choosing, because they don't want to raise a question for fear of what their peers will think about that question, how it might label them. They may pay a social price or a cost in their own relationship to their peers. They would miss some opportunities.
That's right. And the framework, I think, does an excellent job of pointing under the kind of expressive freedom we want to establish, the norms for our students, that you need multiple norms in place at one time. So it's not just courageousness to say something that might be harmful or upsetting. It is also the toleration to hear that in return, balanced by, as the authors lay out, conscientiousness. And I think that's one way to negotiate this. Your ideas, your questions, your intellectual risk-taking, that is what we want and welcome and cherish, as the authors say. But we can help students learn how to conscientiously engage in that kind of dialogue. And those are the important things to tease out, because it might be an important idea or question or risk, but we might need to coach the student into how to say that in the right way, to engage in it conscientiously. And that's a different decision than I'm actually going to push back on that thinking or say this is not within our norms of expressive freedom we want to permit.
So the way I would like to wrap this up is to invite you all, if you'd like to share a brief story about a teacher who was influential for you or important for you, and maybe drew on some of the skills we've been talking about in this conversation. So, Ted, do you want to go first?
Sure. I've been thinking about a colleague of mine who was extraordinarily adept in the classroom at presenting multiple perspectives, of helping students learn how to think, of engaging with these kinds of questions. And it was almost the end of the year, in our first year working together, that I realized this person had been arrested multiple times in their own civic protests going back decades. And, through a commitment to civil disobedience. And to me, it was an amazing example of how to live out your own civic and political commitments in a really deeply felt and personal way with real stakes, and to then show up authentically with kids in that role as an educator. I think it was a really extraordinary model that I've taken with me, that person willing to put themselves on the line in their own life outside of school could say, we have to protect this sense of what we're calling in the framework non-partisanship. That person was as committed to it as anyone. I thought was a really powerful example.
That's great. Chana?
I have a undergraduate math teacher who's still alive, with whom I am at a 45-year connection and correspondence. But those, I could name all of them. But the one person that I decided to mention is, I was a physics major as an undergraduate. And I was conducting an experiment leading up to the Thanksgiving break, and I didn't get it done, and I couldn't abandon it because it was time sensitive. So I stayed over on that weekend and into that Monday and Tuesday of Thanksgiving week. And I was in the science building, and my advisor was there as well, a man by the name of Dudley Town. And this was 1977. And he had a belt buckle, and on this belt buckle was the Greek lambda. And he was in the building walking by, and I was there in between doing my experiment and saw him. And I said, well, great belt buckle, Professor Town. I'm thinking he's my physics professor. And it's wavelength, and it was just a way of, he saw this and liked it. And I said, so you do a wavelength buckle? And he said, no. You have a minute? All right. And we sat down in his office, and he told me, as whatever it was, a 20-year-old, that it was a symbol that gay men used in terms of their unification for it. And that he trusted me enough. I did not know in 1977 that Lambda had that meeting. But that relationship that he had, and my respect for him, and even the way he approached it, do you have a minute? No, you were trusted? Yes, you are. I have a minute, but I'll tell you what this means. That relationship, I learned a lot about wave theory from him, but I learned more from him about so many other things because of that, the nature of the relationship and the interest that he took in me.
I love to ask people just to tell me about a formative teacher, because you get you get passion, you get vividness. Like, people have these incredible connections to their teachers. It feels like reverence to me when I listen to people talk about their teachers. So thank you so much, Ted Ogden. Thank you so much, John Gulla. It's been great talking with you all. And thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed the podcast, subscribe to our channel, hit the like button. We'll see you next time.